This screencast is meant to serve as a reference guide for how to set up quickly Laravel projects in both Homestead and Valet. We'll start by demoing 3 different project setups. The first one, a Laravel project using Homestead. The second, a Laravel project using Valet. And third, a WordPress project using Valet. And for each, this will include pulling in the project files, testing the project in the browser, and confirming the database connection. As we go through these demos, I'll be a little bit light on detail. For these, we're assuming that we have everything installed and are familiar with the processes for each scenario. So we're basically just trying to show how efficient the normal workflow can be. Later on, when we're installing everything from scratch, we'll go into much more detail. So after the demos, we'll briefly go over the directory structure, as well as the path environment variable. So the directory structure in the sense of our project files, these tools that we're utilizing for the development environment, and the path environment variable as it relates to the executables that these development environment applications make use of. And then we'll step back and redo the process, but in more depth, installing Homestead and Valet from scratch, reinstalling the projects, and making the database connections. So let's begin. We'll start with a new Laravel Homestead project. And this will pull in a fresh install of the project. And just to note that at the time of this recording, Laravel 5.3 is about to come out. If we wanted to pull in that development branch, we could do the following. Composer, create project, Laravel, Homestead project, or whatever the name of your project is, dev develop. But we'll just stick with the default install for now. We'll update the homestead.yaml file. Under our sites key, we'll add the Homestead project domain and path. And we'll also note that Homestead creates the database Homestead by default. Next, we'll update our host file. And we'll set the Homestead IP address, the 192.168.10.10, also to point to Homestead Project App. We'll run Homestead provision to reprovision the machine, which will establish all of those connections as well as build that database, Homestead. And test it out in the browser. And our new install is up and running. Let's test the database connection. And to do that, we'll SSH into our virtual machine and project code directory. And from here, we'll run the default migration that comes with Homestead out of the box. That besides setting up a migrations table, we'll also set up a users table and a password resets table. And now let's take a look at them in the MySQL database. From our default Homestead setup, we know that the username is Homestead and the password is secret. And we can see that we have our Homestead database. And taking a look at the tables, we can see the 3 tables: migrations, password resets, and users. And that's all it took to set up the new project, to be able to see it live in the browser, as well as interact with the database. And now let's do the same thing, but using Valet. So once again, from the code directory, we'll set up a new Laravel project. And we'll call this Valet project. And when that's done, we can confirm in the browser. Now, I had already set this up previously, and that's the reason why the domain name is cached, but we are working from a new project install. But the only difference with Valet projects is by default we add the .dev top level domain. And just to confirm that this actually is running a new project, we'll open it up in Sublime, go into our welcome.blade.php file, and update the title, refresh the browser, and we can see that it updates. The difference with Valet, however, is we do have to set up the database manually. So we'll start up the local MySQL server if it's not already running and log in. Username is root and there is no password. Now we'll create the database and we'll call it Valet. And to make sure our new project is in sync with that database, we will update the .env file. So we named the database Valet. Username was root and no value for password. Save and close out of that. From within our project, we have access to the same artisan commands as we did on our Homestead virtual machine, only this time we're running them now on the local machine. And as you can see, we had the two tables migrate similarly, so we already know that the database connection is working, but again, let's go check. Let's show the databases, and we can see the Valet database. And showing the tables shows that we did indeed migrate the same three tables, but this time with Valet and the MySQL server here on our local machine. And that's all there is to setting up a Laravel project with Valet. Now let's try it out using the WordPress CLI. So back within our code directory, we're going to make a directory called WordPress project. We'll cd in, and from there we'll run WP core download. Next we'll need to create a WordPress user for our local MySQL database. We'll log in with our root credentials. So the username will be WordPress, and the password will also be secret. And then we'll grant all privileges to this WordPress user. And exit. Next we'll run the command that allows us to set up the WordPress config file, and it will take a few arguments. The database name of WordPress, the database user of WordPress, the database password of secret, and the database host default localhost IP address. And with that config file set up, we will create the database. And finally, we'll do the core install. And it too will take a few arguments. We'll give it the URL of WordPress project.dev, again conforming to the Valet top-level domain. We'll pass it the title of WordPress project. An admin user of Ryan. This will be for logging into the backend, as well as the password for the backend. As well as my admin email. Now all that's left to do is try it out in the browser. And again, I had set this up earlier, but it is a fresh install. And the default template appears. We can also access the backend login and try out our username and password. And we have access to the dashboard. So now it's just a matter of using the GUI or some of the other WordPress CLI features for going ahead and installing templates and updating plugins. But quickly, let's go see the database and check out the tables. So we'll log in with our WordPress user credentials, and the password is secret. We can see that we have the WordPress database. And if we take a look at the tables, we can see that we have the standard WordPress tables. So that's it for the demos. Now let's take a step back and dig into the details a little bit more. We'll be assuming you're familiar with Laravel, the command line interface, MySQL from the command line, Homestead, Composer, and Brew, and we're using a Mac. And I'm also using, instead of bash profile, using Z shell. So we'll be making reference to my .z/shrc file as well as an aliases file. And here's a list of the current versions. Again, Laravel 5.3 is to come out within the next couple of weeks. A list of related resources. I have a gist that goes over the process we're about to do now. So just search under Development Environment Setup for Laravel under my GitHub name. There's a great Laravel podcast where Taylor Otwell explains the differences between Homestead and Valet and gets into some of the details about why they built Valet and how it works. And we have the Homestead and Valet documentation references, as well as Vagrant, VirtualBox, and the WordPress CLI. Now let's take a look at the directory structure for the relevant folders and files that apply to what we've been doing. Running cd, as we've just done, takes us back to the home directory. If we list all the files in the home directory, we see the following. So it has directories like desktop, documents, downloads. This is the normal view that we're used to seeing outside of the command line. It also has the WordPress CLI, Valet, Vagrant, npm. It has a Homestead reference and the Z shell reference we were talking about, just to name a few. But I've written a gist that consolidates this list a little bit more, focusing only on the relevant folders and files. So the code directory is where I store all of my Laravel projects. This is a standard practice of Jeffrey Way that I implemented. This Composer directory has the packages and executables that Laravel especially makes use of. We can see in the bin directory that it points to both the Laravel installer and Valet installer executable links. I'm referencing the documents directory, as mentioned before, just to show perspective where these other folders are in relation to folders we're more familiar with. The Homestead directory is the main directory for Homestead's install. When we run the command to initialize the .yaml file, it's created and stored within the .homestead directory. And as we've seen previously, the homestead.yaml file is what manages our paths and domains, as well as providing the information for databases. And when Homestead reprovisions, it's the file that gets called on to reset the Homestead machine. The Vagrant and VirtualBox folders are located here as well. Valet also has its main directory here, as it serves websites from our local machine. And then we have the Z shell bash script file. And this is what I use to reference my path environment variable. I also have it linking to an aliases file. So when we go up a couple of directories from there, we're looking at the root directory. So for example, listing all the folders and files. The main ones of interest for our purposes are the user directory and the etc directory, which actually appears to be a link. We make use of the hosts file when we set our Homestead IP address to the domain of our project. So Homestead is making use of this host file in being able to synchronize from the virtual machine to our browser and local machine. Within this user directory, we'll see that WordPress uses it as a place to store the WordPress CLI executable link. So what allows us to run the WordPress commands is based on this bin directory and executable within it. Valet has us install the newest version of PHP, and this is where that version and PHP ini file are located. If there are any issues with the server timing out or being able to upload certain size files or not, this is where you can address that within that PHP ini file. And by running cd, we're back to the home directory. So now what we want to do is address the path environment variable as it relates to calling executables from the command line. Linux books are going to explain that the path environment variable is intended to give the root user access to certain administrative commands. And our applications are making use of this feature by utilizing the bin directory. For example, if we run Laravel from the command line, we'll see output instructing us on how to utilize that command. Same for running Valet. So what's going on is that each of these applications are making use of this convention by placing the executable or the link to the executable within the bin directory. So there are a couple of ways that we can link to these directories where those executables are. First option is to alias the path, and we can store the alias within, I have mine in my ZSHRC file. If not, you may be using the bash profile, and then I actually am linking my Z shell file to an alias file strictly for these kinds of things. We can also update the path environment variable. So as you can see, the path environment variable here is adding on the users Ryan Dobbs composer vendor bin in order to run, in this case, both the Laravel and Valet executables, because as we saw earlier, they're located within that bin directory. So by adding directly on to the path environment variable, it allows our system, which checks all of these bin directories for executables, when we run those executables from the command line, it's going through each one of those directories until it finds the executable, or as I said, the other option being when we key in the alias, it immediately executes the alias based on the path provided. And if you don't see this type of output, nothing gets returned when you run something that you think should be an executable command. It just means that this part is not quite set up correctly. So with this in mind, let's move on to installing from scratch both Homestead and Valet. So I've gone back and removed some folders and files so that I can work along with the installs from scratch. We'll be following along with the documentation for each of the three setups. The Homestead documentation, the Valet documentation, and the WordPress CLI documentation. So beginning here, Homestead wants us to have installed the VirtualBox and Vagrant. These are both one-click installs pretty much, so we're assuming those are at least already installed. And then continuing along, we'll be adding the Vagrant box through this command. And as this will take some time, we'll use the magic of screencasting, as Jeffrey Way likes to say, and come back when it's done. Next up, we will clone the Git repository. And then run bash init.sh, running it from the Homestead directory, of course. And this directory is what was cloned from the Git repository. So Homestead is initialized, and therefore we have the .homestead directory, and it has our homestead.yaml file, as well as a couple of others. So let's go ahead and edit our homestead.yaml file. And now we're back to part of the same process as before. This time let's make the new project Homestead from scratch. So we'll update the domain, as well as updating the path. And this time let's also add another database. Instead of using the default Homestead for the new project, let's use Homestead Scratch. And we'll do this just so that there's a little bit of a difference from what we were doing before. Oh, and before I forget, if you still haven't had the need to set up the public and private SSH keys, a Google search of generate SSH key should point you in the right direction. And like before, we need to update the etc host file. And just to note that it is in the root directory. So as you can see, this is one of the files that I didn't actually clean up, but we'll copy it and update the domain name. Save and close. And then go to our code directory and pull in the new install. And again, just for the sake of doing something different, let's go ahead and pull in the development version. So that's Composer, Create Project, Laravel, Homestead from scratch, Dev Develop. And this will take longer than usual. The development versions don't pull in as quickly. So we will once again come back when the install is done. It asks us if we want to remove the existing version control. Yes. We'll open the project up in Sublime. And in our composer.json file, we see that we're running 5.3. And since we have the brand new Homestead box, we'll cd into the Homestead directory and run Vagrant up. And this is firing up our Homestead machine. So the machine has basically been provisioned for the first time. We can see that we have our Homestead from scratch app. So let's go test it out in the browser. And we have the new version of Laravel installed. Something to point out: before, when we ran Homestead, we would actually be executing the Vagrant command. Let me show you what I mean. The documentation suggests that if we want to run Homestead as a command from anywhere in our system, we need to use it as a function. This code snippet is either in my zshrc file or my aliases file. Okay, so it's not here, but as we were talking about the path variable earlier, this is how I have mine set up. So users, Ryan Dobbs, composer, vendor bin, that's what gets us to running the Laravel and Valet commands. And this is how the path variable was set up originally. But now back to checking the function for Homestead. And here is where we have the Homestead function. So we can see that it changes directories via the home directory and then goes into the Homestead directory, and from there it executes the Vagrant commands. So this is what allows us to execute commands like Homestead up or Homestead SSH. So we'll save and close, and then we need to make sure that we load a new window for the changes to take effect. And now if we run Homestead, we have access to all of those commands. So let's SSH into the Homestead machine. And again, we know that we can run this from anywhere. Go to our code directory, and we know that this is synchronized with the code directory on our local machine. And to show that, we'll take a look at both side by side. So if we go to the code directory and list its contents, you can see that we see all of the same directories. From here, we know we're operating from within the virtual machine, however. That gives us access to the MySQL server and database on the Homestead machine. And in order to test out the database connection like we did before, let's go directly to the Homestead project. And from within the Homestead project, we know that we have access to Laravel's artisan commands. But if we want to be able to access that database in order to migrate the new tables, we need to first tell Homestead to use the new database. So from our local machine, because we have access to Sublime here, let's open the project. So within our .env file, we will tell it to use the database Homestead Scratch, and we'll leave the username and password as the same. But before this will take effect, we need to reprovision the Homestead machine. Now let's test it out. So PHP artisan migrate from within the Homestead from scratch directory. Okay, it says they were successfully migrated. Root users Homestead. Password is secret. Show the databases. We have both our Homestead and Homestead Scratch databases. So we'll take a look at the Homestead Scratch database. And we see that the three tables did indeed migrate. And that's all there is to setting up Homestead from scratch. Now moving on to setting up Valet from scratch. The first thing the documentation tells us to do is to update brew. So if you don't already have Homebrew installed, you'll want to take a look at the Homebrew documentation, which is also very easy to set up. Next, we'll install PHP 7. And for me, this is already installed. And now we'll install Valet through the Composer Global Require command. And with Valet installed, the documentation is alerting us to the issue of the path directory that we have discussed. And that leaves us to run the Valet install command. So with Valet installed, we go to our code directory, or if you were running it under Sites, and run Valet Park. And now any of the directories within here will be able to run with the project name and the .dev top-level domain. So let's create a new project, and we'll call it Valet from scratch. I mean Laravel new, not Laravel install. And with that done, we can once again go test the project. And we have the new project up and running using our new install of Valet. The documentation suggests that we run MariaDB, also MySQL is fine. So brew install MariaDB or brew install MySQL. I'm going to go ahead and run MySQL, and I already have it installed. And the next step would be to start the MySQL server. If you ran into a situation where you received an error upon starting the MySQL server, it has to do with a process ID file not being able to be updated by your system. In order to give your root user the permissions to be able to update that file, go ahead and run this command, sudo chown-r with the whoami:admin, and that will be directed towards your user local directory, and the local directory is where, as you can see, this file will be located. So if you did or did not have errors, and we are up to this point with the server being successfully started, we'll once again go ahead and create a new database. So we'll go ahead and log in, and just to note that by default, the MySQL setup on your local machine should default to a root username and an empty string for the password, whether you're using MariaDB or MySQL. Once inside, we'll set up the new database, and we'll call the database Valet Scratch, just to have something different. And with the database set up, we can run our migration to test the connection. And again, with Valet, we're running on our local machine, and therefore not using a Homestead machine, not using a virtual machine. So we'll go into our new project directory, and from within the project directories we have access to the artisan commands. And because we have the new database, Valet Scratch, we need to make sure that it is synced up in our .env file. So from Sublime, the database name is Valet Scratch. The username is root, and there is no password. And with that information updated, we can now run the artisan command to migrate the database. And logging in to confirm. We see that we have our Valet Scratch database. And the 3 tables from the migration. And that's all there is to setting up Valet from scratch. And regarding getting the WordPress CLI on our system, since we already have Valet installed and are installing WordPress projects using Valet, all we have to do is follow the WordPress CLI installation instructions, which includes a curl command. They advise you to test to check that it's working, and then modify the permissions to allow you executable access on this file, and then change the location of the file again to a bin directory where the WordPress executable will be accessible from the command line. And that's it. The process of installing a new project is just like it was in the demo. If you've made it this far, I hope you've gotten something from the screencast. This exercise is really mainly for me to just reinforce the learning, and also this screencast specifically for me to have something to reference for the routines that I don't do every day, because I'm not necessarily setting up a project every day. And when I run into trouble in setting up a new project, it's nice to have a place to go to have a reference. So again, as always, I'm very appreciative of the open source community, and a big fan of the Laravel framework and the Laracast screencasts. So always many thanks to Taylor Otwell and Jeffrey Way. And again, hope you got something from it. This was a great exercise for me.